Wow, what an intro. First, I want to congratulate everybody who came here after yesterday's party. Thank you for waking up. It was pretty good. It was pretty crazy. If I make any mistakes today, blame it on the party. Not my fault. Today we're going to talk about the history of ransomware. The history of cybersecurity in general is something that is really interesting to me. It's something that I think we can still learn a lot from. And it's very interesting. So I hope today we can have a chat, we can learn something new, we can have some fun, and that it's going to be interesting and educational for everybody. My name is Eliad Kimhy. I lead the security research publication at Akamai. I also used to produce a podcast about the history of cybersecurity called Malicious Life. If you want to check it out, there's a lot of interesting information. Some of it is even in this talk. So what are we going to do today? We're going to hear a lot of stories. Stories from the first ransomware, all through the evolution, stories from recent history, from ancient history. What has changed? How did it evolve? And what can we possibly learn from it? And if you're in this with me, then let's go on this journey together. And let's start with a question. We'll play a little game where nobody has to do anything because you're all the way over there. But if anybody knows, just try to guess what was or when was the first ransomware incident. 2006, 1989, 1996, 2013. Does anybody actually know? Want to scream? All right, never mind. If you guessed 1989, you're correct. That was the first ransomware incident. And that might not sound like a long time ago, but considering the fact that I think ransomware really blew up in the consciousness, in the mind of people in the past, let's say 5 to 10 years. We had a panel yesterday, we talked a little bit about WannaCry, the incident from 2017. Big ransomware incident, kind of shook the world. So considering the fact that ransomware really kind of blew up in the past 5 to 10 years, when you think about 1989, that's a long time ago, and it turns out ransomware has a very long and interesting history, and a very weird one as well. And the weirdness starts with the first ransomware. In 1989, there was a man by the name of Joseph L. Pope, and he had this brilliant plan that he was going to write a virus, he was going to send it to people, and when they installed this virus, their files would get encrypted, and then the virus would ask them to turn on their printer because ransomware didn't go paperless yet in 1989, and they would print out, they would get a ransom note. And this ransom note, which you could see here in sort of a digital form, the ransom note would tell them that they have to pay $378 in cashier's checks to Joseph Pope. Obviously, they wouldn't send it to him directly. Duh. They would send it to a P.O. box in Panama. That was his brilliant idea. 2 birds in 1 stone, I guess. He goes on vacation in Panama and he gets to collect the cash. Win-win for everybody except for the victim. So that was his plan. And Joseph Pope called it the AIDS information software, and we call it the AIDS Trojan. And it's a terrible name. I hate that it's named after such a terrible virus. But there was a reason for that, and it's pretty clever reason, pretty ingenious. Because in 1989, the AIDS virus was something that it was an epidemic. Everybody was thinking about it. It was top of mind. And so Joseph L. Pope thought, if I can send people something that will grab their attention, then they might open it, they might run it, and they might get infected. So in the 1980s, it was the AIDS virus. 3 years ago, COVID. So already we find like the connection to, some kind of connection to modern ransomware, because we know that COVID, for example, was the topic of a lot of phishing emails. Attackers use the confusion of people around this topic of COVID to try and get them to infect themselves. So really, really funny that in 1989, I think over 30 years ago, somebody figured out the same thing that we're still doing today. We'll find now, as we look at the history of this ransomware and other ransomware, we'll find that there's a lot more parallels, a lot more interesting parallels to what we're doing today. But let's look. So that was the plan. He had this brilliant plan in his head. How did it actually work? So I split it into 3 parts, right? Part 1, delivery. Part 4 is profit, I guess, or maybe that's part 3. Part 1 is delivery. So Joseph L. Pope decided he's going to send this virus, 1989, with floppy disks. He purchased 10,000 floppy disks. Good, I'm glad people are laughing. He had to copy the virus onto each one of these. He had to put them in an envelope, and he had to send them. Also, he had to figure out who to send them to. We're talking actual mail. So he had to obtain mailing lists of popular researchers for the AIDS virus. Joseph L. Pope actually was in the community of researchers for the AIDS virus, which makes it even worse. And he was able to obtain some mailing lists, and he was able to send it to researchers. So this is a costly way to deliver. We're talking about 1980s, right? Very costly, very slow, time-consuming, terrible. The encryption, also interesting in that it was terrible as well. He wrote the encryption himself. It was very basic encryption. It was symmetric encryption, which means the same key that you use to lock it up is the same key that you use to unlock it. That's not good, because if you put it in the code, then anybody looking at the code can then reverse the encryption. So he did that. It was actually a substitution cipher, which, if you know ciphers, is not a very complex thing. So he wrote this. However, this is the 1980s or 1990s. A lot of people didn't understand how this stuff works, what this encryption means. People panicked, and they deleted their files. And he sent it almost exclusively to people who are working on research for a cure for AIDS. How terrible is that? And in some cases, 10 years of research were erased from existence because of this silly little encryption. And we'll find, by the way, we'll look at all these 3. We'll look at the evolution as well as we kind of move towards the modern age. But you also find that there's a little reason for how Joseph Pope was basically taken down with every one of these little steps. And then let's look at the business model as last. The old 2 birds, 1 stone, right? Send me money to Panama. I'll go on a vacation to Panama and collect the money at the same time. As you can imagine, one thing that Joseph L. Pope didn't think about was that his name was on the bank account in Panama. And so maybe, I don't know, he had some idea that he would be so far away that nobody could ever extradite him. But in reality, you know, it sounds like some brilliant thing that he did. In reality, Joseph L. Pope was actually, turns out, a little bit crazy. And we find out, as the story wraps up, we find out what actually happened to him. But each and every one of these little things brought to his arrest. You know, the fact that it was Panama and he had his name on the account meant that they could actually find out who he was, who was behind this. The fact that it encrypted and did damage to actual researchers meant that there was some consequences. It wasn't just a joke. Remember, 1989, viruses were a lot of people didn't even know viruses existed, right? It wasn't such a big deal. But it had some consequences, so then it became a big deal. And the delivery, they found 10,000 floppy disks still sitting in his parents' house in Ohio. So there was some evidence there, some physical evidence that got him caught. So how did he get caught? They actually didn't do any manhunt. There wasn't like some CSI operation, you know, raiding his house. Actually, in Amsterdam, in the airport, there was a man walking around, kind of confused. Some people reported it. The police grabbed this man, try to make sure that he's okay, and they find out this is our guy, old Joey Pope, walking around aimlessly. So they caught him, and they thought he was this mastermind criminal, and they brought him to trial. And then he'd show up to trial with things on his head, with curlers in his beard, with tinfoil hats. Turns out he was really insane. And joke's on us, I guess, because he invented ransomware. But turns out he was really insane. And they let him go. Because in 1989, if you wrote ransomware, you were crazy. They thought you were crazy. But today, if they find you wrote ransomware, they're going to throw you in prison. But let's look at each one of these. And I want to just kind of talk about the evolution of each one of these things. And I think each one has like a story to tell us and something maybe to learn about ransomware. So all good so far? Awesome. I want to thank you guys. Thanks for laughing. This is so far a really fun talk. So let's talk about encryption. I'm going to sort of got some dramatic build-up to do here. So we'll start with the middle. I want to talk about encryption. How did that evolve? We started with the symmetric encryption of Joseph Pope. Now, in that time, most viruses didn't really encrypt. Honestly, most viruses just either did something silly to your computer, like all the letters would drop, or you'd get a ping pong ball or something, or they did something really malicious, like slowly delete your files until you realize 2 weeks later that your computer is just gone. Like, they would do these things. They didn't really encrypt anything that wasn't really in the repertoire. Maybe there were a few viruses that did that. But the thing about the encryption that Joseph Pope did, the symmetric encryption, is if you know anything about encryption, you know that asymmetric encryption had existed in 1977. It was first sort of created as a mathematical model. It was just not created for computers, or I think it just didn't exist it wasn't written for computers, this type of asymmetric encryption. Definitely not for malware writers. So what was the evolution? I want to take a little detour. Before we get too much into the encryption, I want to take a little detour. I told you there's dramatic buildup. And I want to talk about something that is very much related to the phenomenon of ransomware. Screenlockers. So in 2010, these things were popular. Some of you might remember them. The thing about asymmetric encryption is that it's kind of hard to write into code. So what is easier and better than writing asymmetric encryption and locking somebody's computer? Not writing encryption and still locking somebody's computer. All that these things would do is they would try to scare the shit out of you. They would lock up the screen, they would cover the screen, you would not be able to exit this, and then it would be this big message. The FBI, you can see the logos here, all three at the same time. The FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the DOJ are telling you that you're a criminal for all these laws because you have these crazy videos on your computer, and because you're such a huge criminal, we're going to ask you to send us $300 in gift cards. We need some money for lunch. And I mean, I think the trick is, and this is the trick for a lot of phishing scams and a lot of these things, it's the lowest denominator, right? They're trying to get the people who actually will fall for these things. And some people have fallen for these types of scams. In particular, there was one incident of one person, 2013, 21-year-old man that turned himself in. Turns out he was a criminal, and he actually turned himself in to the FBI. Should have just paid the gift cards. So those are Screenlockers. And I wanted to take this detour because I think there's something interesting about this. You know, encryption isn't just hard, but I think there's other reasons why attackers went for this sort of in the height of sort of the 2010s, rather than go for something a little bit more hardcore like encryption. But I want to go now all the way back, and I want to go back to the topic of encryption, and we've got two pictures here. They're unrelated. These three gentlemen, Rivest, Shamir, and Edelman, I don't know if that's the order, but if you don't know, then it doesn't matter. Rivest, Shamir, and Edelman, 1977, wrote the RSA encryption. That was the asymmetric encryption model. I think they also created RSA as a company. And that was sort of the asymmetric encryption. It had existed as a mathematical model. And in 1996, and this is the picture over here, two completely different researchers in the University of Columbia, computer science, they hypothesized a type of an attack. They call it cryptoviral encryption. And they basically prophesized the creation of ransomware. They actually looked at Joseph L. Pope. So we come back to the original story. They looked at what he did, and they thought to themselves, well, if somebody could, they had a brilliant idea, brilliant plan. If somebody could encrypt somebody's computer, if they could ask for payment in the form of e-money, Now, in 1996, there was no such thing as Bitcoin, or there's no such thing as PayPal. So they hypothesized e-money. Then they ran some scenarios about some types of extortion that could happen resulting from that. And they actually pretty well predicted how modern ransomware would work. They actually also predicted, if you know ransomware today exfiltrates data, they also predicted that. So that's pretty neat. It would take 10 years for the actual first encrypting ransomware to show up. Does anybody know the name of the first ransomware that encrypts? I told you this is a game we're playing in our heads. Nobody has to say anything. But yeah, GPCode in 2006. So GPCode was the first ransomware that would actually do asymmetric encryption. This was, I don't want to sound too enthusiastic. This was a milestone in the history of ransomware. But sorry, I'm on our side. I'm not on their side. But it is pretty interesting because once you develop this type of asymmetric encryption, there's a point where, well, let's talk about this kind of chronologically. First, you would get a job application. It wasn't a job application, plot twist. It would install this ransomware, and you would get encrypted, and you would have to pay. I believe they were using the gift card scam. And the encryption in the beginning, in 2006, was very low rate. It was 330, sorry about that, 330 bits. And 330 bits, you know, decryption can happen even for asymmetric encryption. When it's very simple, you could decrypt it. So 330 bits, security researchers all over the world were like, no problem. Decrypted it, sent out the decryptors. People decrypted their stuff. That was great. A few months later, 660-bit came out. All right, we got this. Researchers started decrypting it. And then 1024, so 1024-bit, and things got complicated. And you could still find forum posts online from that time of people basically creating this movement, trying to get everybody to bring their computers together to have enough computing power to decrypt this ransomware, with high enough level of encryption. But at some point, the encryption became so hard that it was impossible to do it. And I think that is the point where something really locked into place. This milestone was reached. Because once you are not able to reverse the encryption, then I think this is a problem for you with respect to ransomware. And I wanted to touch on a little bit about decryption. Over here, it's hard to read, but this is from Virus Bulletin from 1989. This is about the AIDS Trojan. These researchers actually were able to decrypt the AIDS Trojan because it wasn't so sophisticated. All you had to do is send them a letter in the mail, and they would send you a floppy disk. So that would happen. But today, decryption doesn't really happen. It happens in a case where source code is released, but that is rare. So most of the time, I think there's some efforts to try and decrypt ransomware in general, but I think it doesn't happen very often. So if you've gotten encrypted, you have a problem. And that's the point. So from the old days of Joseph L. Pope till today, we got from very weak encryption, now we have very strong encryption. You have a problem. There's also the type of exfiltration that started in the late 2010s, part of the history, part of this sort of evolution, where these attackers realized if I can be on all these machines and I can encrypt all this data, I can also take some data out. And when I take the data out, I can blackmail you with it. Also, DDoS attacks are a third form of blackmail. But that's neither here nor there. So that is the evolution of the encryption. And now I want to talk about the business model. Let's go back to Panama, the fun vacation with the money on the side. So that was his idea, traveler's checks. Obviously, that doesn't work for the simple reason that you can be identified. If you can be identified, you can be caught. So what have people been doing ever since then to try and stay off the radar? I mean, I think everybody knows what the answer is, right? Everybody knows where we are today, but we'll still go through it and don't spoil. So the first method that was very, very common was gift cards, prepaid debit. This is actually, to be fair, a lot of scams use this even today, not just internet scams, but just regular scams. But the problem with that is that if you want to take $10,000 from a big company, you can't really do it with like $20 gift cards, right? You get $500 $20 gift cards. You need to open a whole new business just to get those processed. So that didn't work very well. By the way, this one on the left is really interesting. It's like one of those FBI, you committed a crime, and there's a feed of your webcam. So that's pretty scary if you think about it. So the next step was electronic currencies. And electronic currencies were very simple. You would put money in, you would get a code, you would send it to your attacker, they would take the code, they would get money out. That would allow you to use more money. It was much more simple. It's kind of the precursor to PayPal and Bitcoin and all these other things. Oops, I spoiled the ending of this story. Bitcoin. But it was kind of the precursor to that. There was a problem, though. It worked like a bank, and the problem with that is that they would report these people to the police. And so, yeah, you could extort a lot more money, but you also go to jail. So that didn't work. All right, but that's another interesting step, and I want to show you another interesting step as well. SMS and premium phone calls. There was actually malware, I think around 2010, that would go on your phone and would start sending SMS to these premium numbers. And you send the SMS to a premium number, the owner of the number gets some money, and that's the whole scam. But here as well, you could be identified, and with these kinds of scams, it just didn't work. One interesting little tidbit, by the way, you can see that this is in Russian. I assume it's in Russian, and I can't read Russian, so I don't know. But there were some articles I read about ransomware sort of coming from the east, sort of making its roots starting out in Russia and then moving to the west in time. So that was, I think, something that I found really interesting, and I didn't really know. But here we get to the biggest element for the business model of ransomware. And you all pretty much know this. It's Bitcoin. And does anybody know what is the first ransomware that used Bitcoin? Again, silent game. I don't know why I'm asking. It's called CryptoLocker. CryptoLocker was the first ransomware to use Bitcoin in 2013. And again, there's a milestone here. There's a point here where there's a foundation of a technology that could keep those attackers anonymous and could enable people to conduct these ransomware attacks a lot more easily. So we get from Panama all the way to Bitcoin. Bitcoin, of course, was created in 2009, not 2013, but you get the point. The CryptoLocker was one of the hottest collabs of the cybersecurity world. It was the Zeus Trojan, which was a very popular botnet and Trojan at the time, and they realized they could drop this CryptoLocker on, and they made a ton of money, which led to this dude. This is the actual dude that ran Zeus botnet. He lives now with his cat and his onesie. This is a real picture. So that's the business model. So we've come a long way. Now these two elements, the encryption and the encryption and the business model, they've kind of locked into place. Not just that, the business model itself has grown. These companies, these ransomware attackers went from a guy in a tracksuit to big companies that just operate like huge companies. And that's in itself is very concerning. Does the delivery do the same thing? Are we all gonna get depressed? Am I gonna tell you that the delivery is clicked into place and there's nothing we can do? I don't know. I'll let you decide. But from the delivery point of view, we're starting out with floppy disks. Where are we going? So the first step I would want to call out is the sneaker net. This is exactly the floppy disk era, because in the 80s and the 90s there was no such thing. Well, there was some precursor to the internet. There was some bulletin boards. There were ways to exchange information. But really, if you wanted to give something to someone, you had to walk over and give them a floppy disk or some kind of physical medium. So the sneaker net, like the shoe, and that was the first step. And actually, in those times, A lot of people didn't believe even that viruses existed because it was just an ineffective means of transferring media. And like I said, viruses were different at that time. They were just a little bit more playful. There was no way to do anything with them. And so that was the 80s and 90s. So what happens next? 95, around that time, we've got a lot of things happening at the same time. We've got the internet kind of getting commercialized, going to a lot of houses. It's great. Of course, the internet is the most safe, security-minded platform in the world. We've got Windows 95, full of bugs. We've got Flash player in 96, also full of bugs. We've got Office full of bugs. We've got a lot of things that came out. And a lot of you might be developers, so you might understand this, but these things weren't built with security. So now we have the emergence of all these things. And all the rage in the mid-90s were spam emails, which are basically phishing. We've got exploit kits, which would basically try to find a vulnerability in your browser. And we've got macro viruses, which would use macros in Office to run code on your computer and basically execute viruses. And some of you who maybe are researching security today or doing some security work today might say, wait a minute, macro viruses, I still see them today, like they're one of the most common ways of injecting malware through phishing. And I say, yes, they've existed since 95, and they still exist today. And also exploit kits existed since the mid-90s, and they still exist today. Because nothing changes, I guess, and time is a circle, and we're all doomed. So that was all the rage in the 90s, and you can see that a lot of these techniques, and this is the interesting thing I found about the delivery, is a lot of it is kind of going in parallel. Phishing emails started around that time, and they're still popular. Exploit kits are still operational, and macros, oh god, they're still very much operational. I don't know why they haven't been turned off. There must be some kind of good reason for that, Microsoft. What's next? So if you're old enough to know these programs, you would know that in the 2000s, one great way to get infected was before the emergence of Spotify, where you could just stream songs. If you wanted to listen to the latest Britney Spears, you had to download it. And sometimes it wasn't a Britney Spears song, and then you'd say, oops, I did it again, but for the wrong reasons. And so downloading something you shouldn't have was a problem, and it's still a problem today. So time is a circle, and everything just you know what I'm talking. Also worms, just to make a note, in that type of era. Worms were really all the rage, and worms were the kind of thing that would just kind of tunnel between computers, and they were all over the place. There was just a bunch of worms kind of jumping around between computers. Everybody wanted to build one. They were mostly harmless, unless they weren't harmless, and then they created huge problems for everybody. I'm going to shorten the timeline now, and we're going to go straight to 2010, and we're going to talk about Trojans, botnets, and all these things. So remember the guy in the tracksuit? He wrote a Trojan called the Zeus Trojan. And back in the day, Trojans were mostly banking Trojans. So what they would do is they would sit on your computer, they would get to your computer somehow, they would sit there, and they would try to log all the details of your banking account. They would wait for you to type down all your information, and they would steal it. They're trying to steal money. Very straightforward way. They did that for a while, and then they realized, wait, actually I can add something on top of that. I can hook all these computers together. I could put a botnet. I already have something on the machine. I can create a botnet. So the Zeus Trojan became the Zeus botnet. And then from the botnet, they realized, well, I can just drop crypto. I can just drop a ransomware on there, or I can drop whatever I want. So that sort of became the birth of the modern attack cycle. And we can kind of look at all of these things together and combine them into what might be the modern attack cycle, where you have the phishing attacks and the macros and the exploit kits that are kind of the infection vectors that are still effective today. You kind of have the The Trojans, which later became downloaders and droppers. For example, Emotet, which is very famous, started out as a banking Trojan. Dridex, I believe, started out as a banking Trojan. All of these banking Trojans eventually dropped the banking element because it just wasn't useful. But they just used the Trojan itself. They rented it out, and they used it to bring whatever other malware that you wanted to bring on there. So that's also the beginning of sort of the malware as a service industry. You could pay somebody to use the infrastructure that they created. And so we can already see that the Trojans bring into the attack this sort of the privilege escalation, the persistence, these types of elements of the attack cycle. And then you see the worms kind of bringing in the tunneling element, the lateral movement or movement between networks, and finally the execution, in this case of ransomware. So that's the evolution all around. And I think one of the interesting things here with this delivery is that we kind of, I don't know, like I said, we kind of went full circle, right? Like you could still infect people with USB sticks, you could still infect people with macros, you could still infect people. All these things still work. They're just existing in parallel throughout time. Ancient dinosaurs just existing. With the encryption, nobody's using symmetric encryption. Nobody's sending cashier's checks to Panama. Those two things have developed to the point where they've just clicked into place. But the delivery is something that I think hasn't really, there hasn't been a development that just clicked it all into place. So maybe it's not all doom and gloom. Maybe we're not all screwed. Maybe there's some things we can think about. And let's look at it from two different angles. One angle is the developer angle. A lot of you are developers. A lot of the reasons why these things can still infect us is the fact that there's a lot of vulnerabilities in software. Sometimes that's unavoidable, but we should always be thinking about security when we develop products. On the other side is security people. We should always be thinking about where can we disrupt the attackers? Because in this process, we've built a lot of areas where they can fail. There's a lot of places where they can fail, whether it's with stopping phishing emails, whether it's with stopping privilege escalation or malware running on your machine, whether it's stopping lateral movement, or even stopping detonation. There's various ways to try and stop them at every stage of the attack. And I think that's something that we can maybe continue to think about and continue to evolve, knowing that we haven't hit that critical point, that critical milestone, where delivery is inevitable. Delivery is still something that we can impact. So that's my talk. Thank you so much. I wanted to end it on a good note. I don't know, the quiet might be ending still on a depressing note. I hope not. Thank you so much for listening. And I think at this point we'll take questions from the audience. Well, thank you.